In the Rocky Mountains of Ethiopia, where the wind carries the echo of millennia-old prayers and where churches were carved directly into the living stone, rests a truth that the Western world never wanted to acknowledge. It is a truth that challenges not only our understanding of the fall of history's most feared angel, but that questions the very foundations upon which Roman Christianity built its spiritual empire. While European cathedrals were erected under the blessing of emperors and popes, dictated dogmas that would serve earthly interests, Ethiopian monks silently preserved manuscripts containing a radically different version of the celestial events that shaped humanity. The Ethiopian Bible, with its 81 sacred books, represents the most extensive biblical canon in world Christianity, a compilation that would leave any Western theologian perplexed by the wealth of texts that were deliberately excluded from the versions approved by Rome. Among these lost texts are the Book of Enoch, considered heretical by the ecclesiastical authorities who preferred to silence its inconvenient revelations, and the Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth, a work that offers perspectives on the divine nature that challenge established dogmas. These ancient manuscripts, protected for centuries in the monastic libraries of Lalibela and Aksum, carry with them an interpretation of Lucifer's fall that transcends the simplistic narrative of pride and rebellion that dominates Western Christian thought. While the Latin tradition presents Lucifer as the archetype of absolute evil, a being who rebelled against God out of sheer vanity and inordinate ambition, the Ethiopian perspective reveals an infinitely more complex and disturbing story. In the ancient pages written in Ge'ez, the sacred language of Ethiopia, Lucifer emerges not as a one-dimensional villain, but as a celestial being who questioned a divine decision he considered fundamentally unjust. This is not a story of gratuitous malevolence, but of a deep theological conflict that occurred in the very halls of heaven, a dispute over the nature of the divine hierarchy and the proper place of each creature in the great cosmic plan. The Ethiopian narrative leads us beyond the allegorical interpretations of Isaiah or the poetic elaborations of Milton, plunging into an understanding that places Lucifer's fall in the context of a fundamental disagreement over the creation of humanity. When God formed Adam from the dust of the earth and commanded all the angels to prostrate themselves before this new creature, the response was not unanimous in the heavens. While most celestial beings obeyed in humble submission, one voice rose in protest, not out of capricious rebellion, but out of a deep theological conviction. Satan, as he is known in the Ethiopian tradition, refused to bow before what he considered a reversal of the natural order of creation. This refusal was not born from the desire to usurp the divine throne, as suggested by the traditional Western interpretation, but from a misunderstood fidelity to the principles he believed to be eternal and immutable. Created from fire and light even before the earth existed, Satan saw in the command to worship a creature made of clay a fundamental contradiction with the celestial hierarchy established since the dawn of creation. His resistance was, from his own perspective, an act of loyalty to the original divine precepts, a defense of the cosmic order he considered sacred and inviolable. It was not hatred of God, but a tragic misunderstanding of the nature of divine obedience and the very concept of spiritual evolution. This radically different understanding of the motives for the angelic fall does not arise from modern theological speculation, but is deeply rooted in the oldest traditions of Ethiopian Christianity, which preserved Semitic and Hebrew elements that were systematically removed or reinterpreted by European Christianity. While the Roman Church, influenced by Greco-Roman philosophy and the political interests of the empire, molded its doctrine to serve the needs of social and spiritual control, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church kept alive a more primitive and, paradoxically, more sophisticated understanding of celestial mysteries, a perspective that did not reduce the cosmic drama to simplistic categories of good versus evil. Ethiopian demonology reveals layers of understanding about Satan that completely defy the Western characterizations of the Prince of Darkness. In the ancient texts preserved in the monasteries of the highlands, we find a being who does not personify absolute evil from the moment of his creation, but who became corrupted through a gradual process of spiritual isolation and increasing bitterness. This transformation did not happen in a single dramatic moment of celestial expulsion, as suggested by Jesus' famous passage about seeing Satan fall like lightning from heaven, but through a slow and painful deterioration that mirrors human spiritual struggles with pride and divine incomprehension. The Book of Enoch, revered in the Ethiopian tradition but rejected as apocryphal by the Roman authorities, offers a more nuanced perspective on the nature of the angelic rebellion. The Watchers, celestial beings who descended to earth to unite with the daughters of men, represent a different category of spiritual transgression, but one that is closely connected to the fundamental question of cosmic order that so troubled Satan. These fallen angels taught humanity forbidden knowledge, metallurgy, enchantments, cosmetics, and astrology, transgressing the established boundaries between the celestial and earthly realms. Their fall was not motivated by pride, but by misguided love and excessive compassion for human suffering. The connection between Enoch's Watchers and Satan's rebellion reveals a broader Ethiopian understanding of the nature of angelic sin, which is not limited to individual pride, but encompasses fundamental questions about the appropriate relationship between different orders of creation. While Satan refused to lower himself before humanity, the Watchers lowered themselves excessively, abandoning their celestial position to mingle with earthly affairs. Both transgressions stem from a misunderstanding of the proper role of angelic beings in the grand scheme of divine creation, suggesting that the problem was not inherent wickedness, but the difficulty of understanding and accepting changes in the divine plan. This more complex perspective on the angelic fall is intimately linked to the pre-Christian cosmology of the Ethiopian region, which recognized the existence of multiple categories of spirits, some malevolent, others neutral, that inhabited the invisible world and influenced human affairs. When Christianity arrived in Ethiopia, these ancient beliefs were not simply discarded, but integrated in a sophisticated way into Christian theology, creating a unique synthesis that saw Satan not merely as an external enemy, but as part of the spiritual geography of the world. This integration resulted in a demonology that recognized moral complexity even in fallen beings, a perspective that would be considered dangerously heterodox by Roman standards. The oral traditions preserved in the most remote regions of Ethiopia speak of Lucifer's appearances not as a horned, terrifying demon, but as a majestic and melancholy figure who emerges as a noble stranger, a king on pilgrimage, or a wandering priest. These manifestations are not described as purely malevolent, but as complex spiritual tests that challenge the faithful to discern between different forms of truth and obedience. In some narratives, Lucifer appears offering genuine wisdom, but within a context that makes its acceptance spiritually dangerous, not because of the falsehood of the knowledge offered, but because of the motivation behind its offer. This more nuanced approach to temptation and evil reflects a theological maturity that recognizes that the greatest spiritual threats often come not from obvious error, but from partial truth presented in the wrong context or with inappropriate motivation. The Ethiopian tradition does not fear exploring these moral complexities because its understanding of redemption is equally sophisticated, recognizing that divine mercy operates in dimensions that transcend the simple legal categories of guilt and innocence that dominate Roman legal thought. The Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth goes even further by suggesting that even the deepest fall is not necessarily beyond the reach of divine restoration. This expanded eschatological perspective is not limited to human salvation, but encompasses the possibility of redemption for all creation, including the fallen angelic beings. Such a concept would be anathema to most Western doctrines, which insist on the eternal and irrevocable condemnation of demons, but it is rooted in an understanding of divine mercy that transcends the limitations of human justice. The preservation of this alternative theological perspective in Ethiopia was not accidental, but the result of unique historical circumstances that allowed Ethiopian Christianity to develop independently of the political and doctrinal pressures that shaped the Church in the West. While European Christianity was forged in imperial councils, where theological issues were decided by both spiritual considerations and political necessities, the Ethiopian Church developed in relative isolation, protected by its mountainous geography and its historical resistance to external colonization. This isolation was not a limitation, but a blessing that allowed the preservation of traditions and texts that would otherwise have been lost in the waves of doctrinal reforms that swept the Christian world. The Ethiopian approach to sacred texts reflects a fundamentally different mentality about scriptural authority and divine revelation. While Western churches established rigorously controlled canons, excluding texts that did not align with specific doctrines or institutional interests, the Ethiopian tradition maintained a more inclusive attitude towards ancient writings, recognizing that divine truth could manifest through multiple sources and perspectives. This openness did not represent a lack of theological discernment, but a mature trust in the ability of the faithful to extract spiritual wisdom from complex texts without the need for excessive doctrinal supervision. The contrast between the Western and Ethiopian interpretations of Lucifer's fall reveals fundamental differences about the nature of evil and redemption that go far beyond exegetical details. The Roman perspective, influenced by Stoic philosophy and the needs of an imperial religion, tended to create absolute moral categories that served both doctrinal clarity and social control. Evil was evil, rebellion was rebellion, and questioning established authority, whether celestial or terrestrial, was intrinsically sinful. This theological simplicity facilitated ecclesiastical administration and control over populations, but at the cost of a deeper understanding of spiritual mysteries. The Ethiopian tradition, on the other hand, preserved a more Semitic and Hebrew understanding of moral complexity, recognizing that even the seemingly most rebellious acts could arise from genuine, albeit misguided, spiritual motivations. This perspective did not justify rebellion, but sought to understand its roots to better address the fundamental spiritual questions it revealed. Satan was not simply condemned as malevolent, but studied as a tragic example of how even spiritual sincerity could become corrupted when separated from humility and openness to the evolution of the divine plan. This difference in approach also extended to the understanding of human nature and the process of salvation. While Western Christianity developed complex doctrines about original sin, predestination, and justification that often emphasized the distance between God and humanity, Ethiopian theology maintained a more optimistic perspective on the human capacity to participate in the divine life. Satanel's story served not as an example of inevitable condemnation, but as a warning about the dangers of spiritual pride and resistance to change, issues relevant to the spiritual journey of any sincere person. The very narrative structure of the Ethiopian texts reflects this fundamental theological difference. While Western versions of Lucifer's fall tend to be relatively brief and categorical, focusing on the final outcome of celestial expulsion, the Ethiopian texts develop the story with much more psychological and theological detail, exploring the motivations, celestial dialogues, and gradual consequences of Satanel's choice. This more elaborate narrative approach is not simply ornamental, but reflects a theological conviction that understanding moral complexities is essential for spiritual growth. The Ethiopian monks who preserved these texts did not do so out of antiquarian interest, but because they recognized in these ancient narratives a spiritual wisdom that remained relevant for their own time. Their meditations on the nature of Satanel were not academic exercises, but spiritual practices intended to deepen their understanding of pride, obedience, and spiritual discernment. This contemplative tradition recognized that studying the angelic fall was not dangerous if done with humility and wisdom, but could be profoundly educational about the subtleties of spiritual life. The contemplative dimension of the Ethiopian tradition regarding the figure of Satanel reveals aspects of Christian spirituality that were largely lost in the evolution of Western Christianity. While the Roman Church developed an increasingly legalistic and institutional approach to evil and temptation, Ethiopian mystics maintained a more psychological and spiritual perspective, recognizing that understanding the mechanisms of the angelic fall could offer valuable insights into the very internal processes of spiritual corruption that threatened every sincere seeker. This was not a morbid fascination with darkness, but a courageous investigation of the shadowy aspects of spiritual existence that others preferred to ignore or simply condemn. The Ethiopian monastic tradition developed specific meditative practices that included contemplation on the nature of celestial disobedience, not to glorify it, but to understand how even seemingly noble motivations could become corrupted when separated from true spiritual humility. These contemplative exercises recognized that Satan represented, in many respects, the personification of the sincere spiritual seeker who got lost in his own intellectual pride and doctrinal rigidity. This perception transformed the story of the angelic fall into a mirror, in which the monks themselves could examine their deepest spiritual motivations and attitudes. The Ethiopian interpretation of Satanel's refusal to prostrate himself before Adam offers layers of meaning that go far beyond the superficial narrative of pride and rebellion. On a deeper level, this story addresses fundamental questions about the nature of spiritual evolution and the difficulty that even elevated beings can have in accepting changes in the divine plan. Satan, created from fire and light, represented an earlier order of creation that had difficulty accepting that divine evolution included the development of apparently inferior life forms that could, paradoxically, contain unique spiritual potentials. This perspective offers a deeply relevant understanding for contemporary spiritual struggles, where people with considerable spiritual development can often find themselves resisting spiritual truths or practices that seem to contradict their previous understandings. The story of Satan thus becomes a warning about the dangers of spiritual rigidity and the inability to grow beyond past spiritual achievements. His tragedy was not his inherent malevolence, but his inability to transcend his own prejudices about how spirituality should function. The Ethiopian texts also preserve a unique understanding of the relationship between spiritual knowledge and humility that was being lost in the development of Western Christianity. The narrative of Satan suggests that genuine spiritual knowledge, when not tempered by humility and openness to continuous growth, can become an even more dangerous source of spiritual corruption than simple ignorance. This perspective offered Ethiopian monks a theological basis for a cautious and humble approach to spiritual knowledge, recognizing both its value and its inherent dangers. The Ethiopian oral tradition, which complements the written texts, preserves narratives of encounters with Lucifer that reveal this moral complexity even more dramatically. In these stories, Lucifer appears not as an obviously malevolent force, but as a corrupted spiritual teacher, who still retains genuine knowledge, but offers it within a context that makes its acceptance spiritually dangerous. These narratives served as advanced exercises in spiritual discernment, teaching the faithful to distinguish between genuine wisdom and corrupted wisdom, between knowledge that liberates and knowledge that enslaves. The theological sophistication of these traditions is evident in the way they approach the question of Satan's redemption. Far from being a frivolous denial of divine justice, the possibility of angelic redemption emerges from a deep understanding of the nature of divine mercy that transcends human legal categories. This perspective did not minimize the gravity of the angelic fall, but recognized that even the most destructive choices could not definitively limit the transformative power of divine grace, an understanding that offered hope even in the most desperate spiritual situations. The eschatological dimension of Ethiopian theology regarding universal redemption reflects a spiritual maturity that transcends the limitations of punitive thought that dominated much of the history of Western Christianity. While doctrines about eternal condemnation often served as tools for social control and ecclesiastical authority, the Ethiopian perspective on the possibility of cosmic restoration emerges from a deep contemplation of the infinite nature of divine mercy. This was not a doctrine developed to accommodate modern sensibilities, but an ancient understanding based on texts and traditions that preceded later theological systematizations. The Book of the Mysteries of Heaven and Earth, one of the most esoteric texts preserved in the Ethiopian tradition, offers glimpses of a spiritual cosmology that recognizes multiple levels of reality and multiple possibilities for spiritual transformation that extend far beyond the simple categories of salvation and condemnation. In these cosmic visions, Satan's fall is seen not as a final and irreversible event, but as a stage in a broader cosmic process of learning and spiritual evolution that could eventually encompass all creation. This perspective did not deny the reality of the suffering caused by the angelic rebellion, but situated even this suffering within a broader context of divine purpose. This expanded eschatological understanding was intimately connected with specific contemplative practices that characterized Ethiopian monastic spirituality. The monks did not just study these texts intellectually, but used them as a basis for deep meditations on the nature of divine and human compassion. Their practices included periods of contemplation on the suffering of all beings, including the fallen angels, not to justify their actions, but to develop a deeper understanding of the universal nature of spiritual suffering and the need for redemption. The preservation of these alternative theological perspectives in Ethiopia occurred not only due to geographical isolation, but also due to a deliberate cultural and spiritual resistance to the homogenizing pressures emanating from Christian centers of power. The Ethiopians recognized that their tradition offered unique and valuable elements that would be lost if they were completely assimilated into external doctrinal norms. This resistance was not based on provincialism or ignorance, but on a sophisticated assessment of the spiritual value of their ancient traditions. The complexity of Ethiopian demonology also reflects influences from older African spiritual traditions that were integrated into Christianity in a creative and theologically sophisticated way. Unlike later colonial approaches that viewed these influences as pagan corruptions that needed to be eliminated, early Ethiopian Christianity recognized genuine spiritual insights in these traditions that could enrich and deepen Christian understanding. This synthesis resulted in a form of Christianity that was simultaneously deeply orthodox in its fundamental commitments and remarkably expansive in its openness to multiple forms of spiritual wisdom. The implications of this approach extend far beyond purely theological issues, offering an alternative perspective on questions of spiritual authority, doctrinal diversity, and the relationship between local and universal tradition. The Ethiopian experience demonstrates that it is possible to maintain deep and genuine Christian commitments while preserving space for theological perspectives that challenge established orthodoxies. This historical demonstration offers valuable resources for navigating contemporary tensions between unity and diversity in Christian thought. The Ethiopian narrative about Satanel also offers unique resources for addressing contemporary questions about the nature of evil and moral responsibility. Its refusal to see evil as an absolute category and its insistence on exploring the motivations and contexts behind destructive actions offers a model for more nuanced and compassionate approaches to complex moral issues. This perspective does not eliminate the need for moral discernment and responsibility, but situates these elements within a broader context of understanding and possibility of transformation. The Ethiopian contemplative tradition also preserved specific practices for working with dark aspects of personality and spiritual experience that were largely lost in other Christian traditions. These practices recognize that authentic spiritual growth requires an honest confrontation with destructive tendencies and questionable motivations, and offered specific methods for transforming these energies in constructive directions instead of simply suppressing or condemning them. The preservation of this alternative spiritual wisdom in the highlands of Ethiopia represents more than a historical or theological curiosity. It offers a silent but powerful testimony about spiritual possibilities that were systematically marginalized or suppressed in the dominant evolution of Christianity. While ecclesiastical councils decided which perspectives would be considered orthodox and which would be declared heretical, often basing these decisions on political as well as spiritual considerations, Ethiopian monastic communities continued their contemplative practices and preserved their ancient texts, keeping alive an understanding of the Christian faith that transcended the limitations imposed by external authorities. Ethiopian resistance to external doctrinal pressures was not based on provincial isolation or rejection of the broader Christian communion, but on a mature understanding that spiritual truth is sufficiently rich and complex to accommodate multiple legitimate perspectives without losing its essential unity. This conviction allowed the Ethiopians to maintain their own spiritual path while remaining open to insights from other traditions, creating a synthesis that was simultaneously distinctly African and profoundly Catholic in the original sense of the term. The implications of this approach for the contemporary understanding of spiritual authority are profound and potentially transformative. The Ethiopian experience suggests that legitimate theological diversity can coexist with deep Christian commitments, and that attempts to impose excessive doctrinal uniformity can result in the loss of valuable spiritual insights. This lesson is particularly relevant in an era when issues of authority, tradition, and biblical interpretation continue to divide Christian communities around the world. The Ethiopian narrative about the moral complexity of Satan also offers important resources for addressing contemporary questions about evil, responsibility, and the possibility of redemption. In a time when extreme polarizations often reduce complex moral issues to simplistic categories of good versus evil, the Ethiopian perspective offers a model for maintaining rigorous moral discernment while recognizing the complexity of human motivations and the universal possibility of spiritual transformation. The contemplative sophistication of the Ethiopian tradition, particularly its willingness to explore dark aspects of spiritual experience without fear or condescension, offers valuable resources for contemporary spiritual development. In a culture that often avoids honest confrontation with destructive tendencies or seeks quick fixes for deep spiritual problems, the Ethiopian approach offers a more mature and realistic path to authentic spiritual growth. Perhaps most significantly, the preservation of this alternative tradition in Ethiopia serves as a powerful reminder that the history of Christianity is much richer and more diverse than dominant narratives suggest. While official histories often focus on developments in the centers of political and ecclesiastical power, traditions like the Ethiopian reveal that some of the deepest and most valuable spiritual insights were preserved on the margins, in communities that maintained their spiritual independence despite external pressures. The question that emerges from this exploration is not whether the Ethiopian perspective on Satan should replace traditional Western understandings, but whether there is room in contemporary Christianity for the richness of insights that traditions like this offer. The Ethiopian experience demonstrates that it is possible to be simultaneously faithful to core Christian convictions and open to understandings that transcend familiar doctrinal formulations. This demonstration offers hope for future developments in Christian thought that could integrate the best wisdom of multiple traditions without compromising fundamental spiritual commitments. In the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela, where generations of faithful have sought spiritual understanding through the contemplation of celestial mysteries that others considered too dangerous to explore, the story of Satan continues to echo not as a celebration of rebellion, but as an invitation to spiritual humility and continuous growth. This tradition has preserved not only ancient texts, but an approach to spiritual life that recognizes both the greatness and the fragility of the human quest for divine understanding. As incense rises in the rocky chambers of ancient monasteries, and monks continue their prayers in a language that preserves echoes of times before the establishment of imperial orthodoxies, the wisdom preserved in these traditions remains available to anyone who has enough courage to question established narratives and seek a deeper understanding of the mysteries that shape human existence. The true heresy, this tradition suggests, is not in asking difficult questions about complex spiritual issues, but in accepting simplistic answers to realities that transcend limited human understanding.